The blood on her typewriter keys was still warm when Fleet Admiral Ernest King walked into the records office. 3 sailors had left Irene Hill unconscious in the parking lot that morning, calling her a coward's daughter, a traitor's spy. They'd beaten her for filing reports they didn't want filed, for seeing things they wanted hidden. But what they didn't know, what nobody at the Philadelphia Naval Yard knew in the spring of 1943, was that this 22-year-old clerk from Poland had already survived worse than their fists could deliver. And the Admiral was about to discover why. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. Irene Hill had learned to make herself invisible long before she arrived at the Philadelphia Naval Yard in January 1943. It was a survival skill she developed in Warsaw, then in London, and finally in America, the ability to become so unremarkable that people forgot she was in the room while they discussed things they shouldn't. At 22, she stood barely 5 feet tall, with dark eyes that had seen too much and hands that trembled when she thought no one was watching. Her accent marked her as foreign despite 3 years of careful English practice, and her nervous habit of touching the small silver cross at her throat made the other clerks whisper about Catholic superstition. The Naval Yard employed hundreds of civilian workers, most of them women who'd taken over jobs left vacant by men shipped overseas. But Irene was different. She wasn't American-born, didn't have brothers or a husband in the service, and kept to herself with an intensity that others found unsettling. Her official role was simple: she filed reports, typed correspondence, and maintained records for the Atlantic Fleet's logistics division. It was tedious work that most people found mind-numbing, but Irene approached it with an obsessive attention to detail that bordered on compulsive. What her supervisors didn't know was that Irene read every document that crossed her desk. Not just skimmed, read, analyzed, and memorized. She developed a photographic memory as a child in Warsaw, a talent her father had called both a gift and a curse. Now, working in the heart of America's naval operations, that gift allowed her to see patterns that others missed. By March 1943, Irene had noticed something troubling in the supply reports. Small discrepancies, a few crates of ammunition here, some medical supplies there, nothing dramatic enough to trigger official concern. But the pattern was consistent, always involving the same supply depot, always signed off by the same officer, Lieutenant Commander Harold Brennan. Brennan was popular at the yard, a decorated officer with a wife and 3 children, known for his efficiency and his ability to get things done. He played poker with the other officers, attended church on Sundays, and never missed an opportunity to remind people that his grandfather had fought in the Civil War. Irene had tried to ignore the discrepancies at first. It wasn't her job to audit supply reports, just to file them. But her father's voice echoed in her memory, words he'd spoken in Warsaw before the Germans came: when good people see evil and do nothing, they become part of the evil. She'd started keeping her own records, hidden in a small notebook she carried in her purse. Dates, quantities, patterns. The evidence suggested that Brennan was systematically diverting supplies, probably selling them on the black market. It was treason during wartime, punishable by death. The question was what to do about it. Irene had no proof beyond her meticulous notes, no witnesses, and no credibility. She was a foreign clerk with an accent who'd been in the country less than 4 years. Brennan was a commander with connections throughout the Navy. The decision was made for her on a Tuesday morning in late March when she overheard a conversation in the supply office. 2 sailors were discussing an upcoming convoy, mentioning specific ships and departure times. Standard gossip, except Irene recognized the convoy designation from a classified document she'd filed the previous week. She wouldn't have thought much of it except that one of the sailors mentioned Brennan by name, saying he'd provided the information as usual. The casual way they discussed it suggested this wasn't an isolated incident. That afternoon, Irene typed up a formal report detailing every discrepancy she'd documented, every suspicious pattern, every piece of evidence she'd collected. It was 5 pages long, meticulously sourced, and represented 3 months of careful observation. She addressed it to the Inspector General's office, sealed it in an envelope marked urgent security matter, and placed it in the outgoing mail that evening. Then she went home to her tiny apartment in South Philadelphia and waited for whatever would come next. What came next was worse than she'd imagined. The following morning, Irene arrived at the yard at her usual time, 0630, when the parking lot was still mostly empty. She'd learned to come early, using the quiet hours before the day shift to organize her work and avoid the social dynamics that left her feeling isolated. She was halfway across the parking lot when 3 sailors stepped out from between 2 trucks. She recognized them immediately. They were part of Brennan's regular crew, men who worked the supply depot and often delivered documents to the records office. "Miss Hill," the tallest one said, his voice carrying a threat that made her freeze. "We need to have a conversation about your typing skills." Irene's hand moved instinctively to her purse, where she kept a small can of pepper spray, another survival tool from her time in London. But before she could reach it, the sailor grabbed her wrist. "You've been typing up some interesting stories," he continued. "Making accusations about a decorated officer. That's not very patriotic for someone who just got off the boat." "I don't know what you're talking about," Irene said, her accent thickening with fear despite her attempt to stay calm. "The Inspector General's office forwards certain complaints back to the unit for internal review," another sailor explained. "Brennan saw your report this morning. He's not happy." The first blow caught her in the stomach, doubling her over. The second hit her face, splitting her lip and filling her mouth with blood. Irene tried to scream, but a hand clamped over her mouth as they dragged her between the trucks, away from the view of the main gate. "You foreign spies are all the same," the tall sailor hissed. "Come here pretending to help, but really you're just causing trouble. Well, here's what we do with troublemakers." The beating lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. They were methodical about it, avoiding her face after that first hit, concentrating on her ribs and stomach where the damage wouldn't show. Professional violence, the kind that sent a message without leaving obvious evidence. When they finished, they left her crumpled between the trucks, her purse scattered across the ground, her carefully maintained invisibility shattered by pain and humiliation. Irene lay there for several minutes, tasting blood and fighting the urge to vomit. Her ribs screamed with every breath, and her vision blurred with tears she refused to shed. She'd survived the German occupation of Warsaw, had made it through London during the Blitz, had crossed the Atlantic while U-boats prowled the shipping lanes. She would survive this too. Irene pulled herself upright using the truck's bumper, her hands shaking as she gathered her scattered belongings. The silver cross her mother had given her lay in the dirt, its chain broken. She picked it up carefully, cradling it in her palm like a wounded bird. The records office wouldn't open for another hour. Irene considered going home, calling in sick, disappearing back into the safety of invisibility. But that would mean Brennan had won, that violence and intimidation had succeeded where they should have failed. Instead, she limped to the women's bathroom near the main gate and used paper towels and cold water to clean the blood from her face. Her reflection in the mirror showed a split lip and the beginning of a black eye, but nothing that couldn't be explained away as a simple fall. She'd become expert at explaining away bruises. It was another skill from Warsaw. By 07:45, Irene was at her desk in the records office, typing with deliberate precision despite the pain in her ribs. Her supervisor, Mrs. Dorothy Fletcher, arrived at 0800 and immediately noticed something was wrong. "Irene? What happened to your face?" "I fell in the parking lot," Irene replied, her accent carefully controlled. "The asphalt is uneven near the east gate." Mrs. Fletcher studied her with the shrewd eyes of a woman who'd raised 3 sons and knew when someone was lying. "That must have been quite a fall." "Yes, ma'am. I'm fine now. You should see the medical officer." "It's not necessary. I just need to finish these reports." Mrs. Fletcher opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. She'd learned over the past 3 months that Irene Hill was stubborn in ways that polite suggestions couldn't overcome. Instead, she simply said, "Let me know if you need anything," and retreated to her own desk. The morning passed in a blur of typewriter keys and filing cabinets. Irene worked with mechanical efficiency, her mind focused on the rhythm of work to distract from the pain. Around 10:30, Lieutenant Commander Brennan appeared in the records office doorway. He was a handsome man in his late 30s, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of command. His uniform was immaculate, his smile warm and professional as he surveyed the room. "Morning, ladies. Mrs. Fletcher, I need to review some supply requisitions from February. I think there might have been some filing errors." "Of course, Commander. Irene can help you find them." Brennan's smile didn't waver, but Irene saw something cold flicker in his eyes as they met hers. "Actually, I was hoping Mrs. Fletcher could assist me personally. I know she's more familiar with our older filing systems." It was a dismissal and a threat wrapped in polite words. Irene kept her eyes down and continued typing, but she could feel Brennan watching her as Mrs. Fletcher gathered the requested files. After they left for the archives, Irene's hands finally stopped shaking. She'd been right about the supply theft, which meant her report had been accurate. But she'd also been naive about what would happen when she filed it. The Inspector General's office hadn't investigated, they'd simply forwarded her accusation back to Brennan's unit, giving him advance warning and the opportunity to silence her. The system was designed to protect officers like Brennan, not foreign clerks like her. At 1200, Irene took her lunch break in the small park outside the Yard's main administration building. She usually ate alone, but today she was joined by another clerk, a middle-aged woman named Ruth Calloway who worked in personnel. "I heard what happened in the parking lot," Ruth said quietly, unwrapping a sandwich. "Or at least, I heard the version those sailors are telling. They're saying you slipped and fell." Irene said nothing, chewing her own sandwich despite the pain in her jaw. "I also heard that you filed a report about Brennan," Ruth continued. "That took courage. Or stupidity. I'm not sure which." "It was the right thing to do," Irene replied. "Maybe. But right things don't always lead to good outcomes." Ruth paused, then added, "My husband served under Brennan in 41. He said the man runs his command like a personal fiefdom. Anyone who challenges him either gets transferred or finds themselves in serious trouble. So I should do nothing? Let him continue stealing supplies while our sailors die for lack of equipment? I'm not saying that. I'm saying you need to be careful. You're not like the rest of us, you don't have family connections, you don't have anyone to protect you. If Brennan decides to destroy you, there's not much you can do about it." After Ruth left, Irene sat alone with her thoughts. The woman was right, she had no protection, no network of relationships to shield her from retaliation. Her parents were dead in Warsaw, her siblings scattered across Europe if they were still alive. She was alone in a foreign country, working at a job that could end with a single phone call. But she also had something that Brennan didn't expect: documentation. Every discrepancy, every suspicious pattern, every piece of evidence she'd collected over 3 months. She'd kept copies of everything, hidden in her apartment where no one would think to look. If the official channels wouldn't investigate Brennan, perhaps she needed to find unofficial ones. That afternoon, as Irene filed reports in the administrative wing, she noticed a door marked Fleet Admiral's Office, authorized personnel only. She'd walked past it hundreds of times but never given it much thought. Fleet Admiral Ernest King commanded the entire U.S. Navy from Washington, but he maintained a small liaison office at the Philadelphia Yard for Atlantic Fleet coordination. The office was usually empty, staffed by a rotating series of junior officers who handled routine correspondence. But today, through the partially open door, Irene could see someone seated at the desk, not a junior officer, but an older man in an admiral's uniform, his shoulders heavy with the weight of 4 stars. Fleet Admiral King himself, reviewing documents at the Philadelphia office. Irene's heart hammered against her damaged ribs. This was either an opportunity or another disaster waiting to happen. King was known throughout the Navy as brilliant but ruthless, a man who demanded perfection and tolerated neither incompetence nor insubordination. He was also known as someone who valued results over protocol, who would listen to anyone if they had information worth hearing. Before she could talk herself out of it, Irene knocked on the doorframe. The Admiral looked up, his expression shifting from concentration to mild irritation. "Yes?" Sir, my name is Irene Hill. I'm a clerk in the records office. I have information about supply theft that I believe requires your immediate attention. King studied her for a long moment, taking in her split lip, her nervous posture, her foreign accent. You have 60 seconds. Make them count. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. Irene spoke quickly, her words tumbling out in a rehearsed sequence she'd practiced in her head all afternoon. Lieutenant Commander Harold Brennan has been systematically diverting supplies from Depot 7 for the past 4 months. Medical equipment, ammunition, fuel, small quantities that avoid triggering official audits, but consistent enough to establish a pattern. The total value exceeds $200,000. King's expression remained neutral. That's a serious accusation. What evidence do you have? 37 separate discrepancies documented across supply reports, requisition forms, and shipping manifests. Each one involves Depot 7. Each one was authorized by Commander Brennan. I have dates, quantities, and destination codes that don't match actual delivery locations. Where is this evidence? Copies are secured at my apartment, sir. I filed a report with the Inspector General's office yesterday, but it was forwarded back to Brennan's unit for internal review. 3 sailors from his command assaulted me in the parking lot this morning. She touched her split lip. They told me to stop causing trouble. King leaned back in his chair, his eyes sharp as broken glass. Why are you bringing this to me instead of going through proper channels? Because the proper channels failed, sir. Because Commander Brennan has connections that protect him from routine investigation. And because every day this continues, our sailors are being sent into combat without the equipment they need to survive. The Admiral was quiet for a moment, studying her with an intensity that made Irene feel transparent. Finally, he spoke. You're Polish. Yes, sir. I came to America in 1939, after the Germans invaded. Your English is excellent. My father was a professor of languages at the University of Warsaw. He insisted his children learn English, German, and French. He said knowledge of languages meant survival. She paused. He was right. Where's your father now? Dead, sir. The Germans shot him in October 1939 for teaching classes in his apartment after they closed the university. King's expression softened almost imperceptibly. I'm sorry for your loss. Why did you choose to work here, at the Naval Yard? Because Poland fell in weeks, sir. France fell in weeks. Britain stands alone because of American supplies shipped across the Atlantic. Every rivet, every shell, every gallon of fuel matters. When I saw someone stealing those supplies, I couldn't stay silent. Her voice grew stronger despite the pain in her ribs. My father died because good people stayed silent. I won't make that mistake. The Admiral stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm ordering an immediate investigation into these allegations. You'll provide all documentation to my office by 0800 tomorrow. In the meantime, you're relieved from your regular duties and placed under protective assignment. You'll work directly for my liaison office until this matter is resolved. Irene felt dizzy with relief and fear. Sir, Commander Brennan will know I came to you. His men will be dealt with if they attempt further intimidation. You're under the protection of this office now. King walked to the door and called for his aide, a young lieutenant who appeared immediately. Lieutenant Morrison, this is Miss Hill. She's been reassigned to our office effective immediately. Arrange quarters for her in the women's auxiliary barracks and post a guard. No one approaches her without my direct authorization. Yes, sir. As Morrison led her away, Irene glanced back at Admiral King. He'd already returned to his desk, but something in his posture had changed, the set of his shoulders suggesting not just authority but personal investment. What Irene didn't know was that King had lost a daughter to pneumonia 3 years earlier, a girl who would have been about Irene's age. and he'd spent every day since then looking for ways to make her death mean something. Sometimes salvation came disguised as coincidence. The investigation began at dawn the next morning with a precision that reminded Irene of surgical operations. Admiral King had summoned 2 investigators from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service overnight, bypassing the normal chain of command entirely. By 0600, they were examining the documents Irene had retrieved from her apartment, 3 months of meticulous record-keeping spread across her small kitchen table. Chief Warrant Officer Raymond Foster headed the investigation, a weathered man in his 50s who'd spent 30 years catching thieves in Navy uniforms. He studied Irene's documentation with the same intensity she'd used to create it, occasionally grunting approval at particularly thorough cross-references. "You should have been an auditor," Foster said finally, looking up from the papers. "This is better work than half my trained investigators produce." "I learned to pay attention to details in Warsaw," Irene replied. "The Germans would shoot you for small mistakes. It made me careful." Foster exchanged a glance with his partner, Lieutenant Agnes Porter, a sharp-eyed woman who'd joined the Waves specifically to work criminal investigations. "Miss Hill, we're going to need you to walk us through every discrepancy. Some of these supply codes are technical, we need to understand exactly what was diverted and where it should have gone." They worked through the morning in Admiral King's office, Irene explaining each notation while Foster and Porter built their case. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it. Brennan would authorize legitimate supply requisitions, then alter the delivery locations after the paperwork was filed. The supplies would be rerouted to commercial warehouses where they were sold to black market dealers. It was elegant in its simplicity, and it had worked because no one person saw the entire process. Except Irene, who read everything and forgot nothing. At 1100, Admiral King joined them, listening silently as Foster outlined their preliminary findings. "We have enough evidence to arrest Brennan immediately," Foster concluded. "But if we move now, we might miss his buyers and distribution network. I recommend surveillance for 48 hours to identify all conspirators." "No," King said flatly. "We arrest him today. Every hour we delay is another hour he has to destroy evidence or flee." "Sir, with respect. My decision is final, Chief. Execute the arrest at 1400 hours. King turned to Irene. "Miss Hill, you'll observe the arrest from my office. I want Brennan to see you standing beside me when we take him into custody." Irene felt her stomach tighten. "Sir, is that wise? If the case goes to court, my presence might be interpreted as vindictive. Let them interpret it however they want. You uncovered this theft. You deserve to see justice served." King's voice carried an edge of something personal. "Besides, men like Brennan need to understand that intimidating witnesses doesn't work when those witnesses have protection." The arrest happened exactly as planned. At 1400 hours, Lieutenant Commander Harold Brennan was called to Admiral King's office under the pretense of discussing supply efficiency. He arrived confident, smiling, completely unaware of the trap closing around him. King stood behind his desk, Irene beside him, Foster and Porter flanking the door. Brennan's smile faltered when he saw the arrangement, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Irene. "Commander Brennan," King began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You're under arrest for theft of government property, black market trafficking, and treason during wartime. Chief Foster will read you your rights." Brennan's face went white, then red with fury. "This is insane." "On whose authority?" "Mine," King interrupted. "Based on evidence compiled by Miss Hill and verified by NCIS investigation. You've been systematically stealing supplies for 4 months, endangering our sailors and profiting from their sacrifice." Brennan's eyes locked on Irene, and the hatred in them was palpable. "You foreign bitch. You have no idea what you've done." "Watch your language, Commander," King said coldly. "Or I'll add threatening a witness to your charges." As Foster and Porter led Brennan away in handcuffs, Irene felt her legs trembling. The confrontation she'd feared for months was over in minutes, but the implications were just beginning. Brennan had connections throughout the Yard, friends who would view his arrest as a betrayal. She'd made powerful enemies today. King seemed to read her thoughts. Miss Hill, you'll continue working from this office until Brennan's trial concludes. I'm also recommending you for a position with Naval Intelligence. Your skills are wasted in a filing room. The retaliation began within hours of Brennan's arrest. By evening, rumors spread through the Philadelphia Naval Yard like oil on water. Irene Hill was a German spy, a communist agitator, a scorned woman seeking revenge for a romantic slight. The stories varied, but their purpose was consistent: discredit the witness before the trial could begin. Irene heard the whispers when she walked through the administrative building, saw the hostile stares from sailors who'd considered Brennan a friend. Someone painted traitor on her apartment door in red paint. Anonymous letters appeared in her mailbox, some threatening violence, others questioning her loyalty to America. Admiral King's protection helped, but it couldn't shield her from the social isolation that followed. The other clerks avoided her during breaks. Mrs. Fletcher, her former supervisor, stopped making eye contact. Even Ruth Calloway, who'd warned her about Brennan, now kept her distance. The loneliness was crushing in ways the physical beating hadn't been. Irene had survived Warsaw by becoming invisible, had endured London by keeping her head down. But here, she'd chosen visibility, had spoken truth to power, and was discovering that courage came with consequences. The breaking point arrived on a Friday evening, 6 days after Brennan's arrest. Irene was working late in Admiral King's outer office, transcribing interrogation notes for the investigation. Morrison, the young lieutenant who served as King's aide, had left for dinner, leaving her alone in the administrative wing. She didn't hear them approaching until it was too late. Four sailors entered the office, their faces hard with purpose. She recognized two from Brennan's supply unit, not the ones who'd beaten her in the parking lot, but associates who'd benefited from his theft operation. "You should have kept your mouth shut," the lead sailor said, closing the door behind them. Irene stood slowly, her hand moving toward the telephone. "Admiral King will be back any moment. The Admiral is meeting with Atlantic Fleet commanders in Washington. He won't be back until Monday." The sailor smiled without warmth. "That gives us the whole weekend to explain why foreign spies aren't welcome at our Navy Yard." Irene's mind raced through options. She was alone in a secure building after hours, with no witnesses and no immediate help available. The telephone might bring guards, but these men would reach her before anyone arrived. Her pepper spray was in her purse, across the room. "I'm not a spy," she said, buying time. "I'm a clerk who reported theft. That's all. You're a Polish refugee who came here under suspicious circumstances. Commander Brennan says you were planted by German intelligence to disrupt our supply operations. The accusations against him are just cover for your real mission." The accusation was so absurd that Irene almost laughed. "That's ridiculous. I escaped the Germans. They murdered my family. Or so you claim. Either way, you've caused enough trouble." The sailor took a step forward. "We're going to teach you the same lesson we taught you in the parking lot, except this time." The door opened behind them, cutting off his threat. But it wasn't Admiral King who entered. It was a captain Irene had never seen before, accompanied by two Marine guards with rifles. "Gentlemen," the captain said calmly, "you're in a restricted area after hours without authorization. I'm going to need to see your identification and an explanation for your presence." The sailors exchanged glances, their certainty crumbling. Within minutes, they were being escorted away by the Marines, their names recorded for disciplinary action. The captain turned to Irene, his expression sympathetic. "Miss Hill? I'm Captain Richard Donovan, Admiral King's Chief of Staff. He asked me to check on you before leaving for Washington." It seems his instincts were correct. Irene sank into her chair, the delayed reaction hitting her like a wave. "How did he know?" "The Admiral has been in the Navy for 40 years. He knows how men like Brennan operate, and he knows how their friends respond when one of their own faces consequences." Donovan pulled up a chair. "He also asked me to tell you something, though I don't fully understand the context. He said, tell her that my daughter would have done the same thing she did, and I would have been proud of her for it." Lieutenant Commander Harold Brennan's court-martial began 3 weeks later in a hearing room that smelled of polish and old paper. Irene sat in the witness gallery, her hands folded in her lap, watching as the prosecution presented her documented evidence piece by meticulous piece. The defense tried to discredit her testimony, painting her as an unstable foreigner with questionable loyalties. They presented character witnesses who swore Brennan was a patriot, a family man, a decorated officer whose reputation was being destroyed by misunderstood paperwork and an overzealous clerk. But the numbers didn't lie. Chief Foster had traced Brennan's diverted supplies to 3 commercial warehouses in Philadelphia, recovering over $100,000 in stolen military equipment. The warehouse owners, facing their own charges, had cooperated fully, providing detailed records of their transactions with Brennan. On the 3rd day of testimony, Admiral King himself took the stand. He wasn't required to testify, his authority alone had been sufficient to order the investigation, but he'd insisted on appearing personally. The defense attorney, a civilian lawyer named Preston who specialized in military cases, approached King with calculated deference. "Admiral, isn't it true that Miss Hill's accusations were initially dismissed by the Inspector General's office as unsubstantiated?" "The IG's office made an error in judgment," King replied. "They failed to properly investigate a legitimate complaint. I've already addressed that failure through appropriate channels." "But surely you can understand how a commanding officer like Mr. Brennan might view Miss Hill's actions as inappropriate? She was, after all, a junior clerk making serious accusations against a superior officer." King's expression hardened. "I understand that Commander Brennan was stealing from the United States Navy while our sailors died in the Atlantic. I understand that Miss Hill showed more courage and integrity than officers with 20 years of service. And I understand that attempts to intimidate her continued even after my office granted protection. Is there a question in your observation, Counselor?" The courtroom went silent. King's reputation for bluntness was legendary, but this was personal in a way that transcended professional duty. Preston shifted tactics. "Admiral, there are those who suggest that your protection of Miss Hill is unusually personal. That perhaps your judgment has been clouded by factors unrelated to this case. Are you questioning my integrity, Counselor?" "I'm questioning whether your relationship with the witness has influenced." "I have no relationship with Miss Hill beyond that of a commanding officer ensuring a witness receives proper protection." King's voice could have frozen the Atlantic. "If you're suggesting something inappropriate, I suggest you present evidence or withdraw the implication." Preston wisely withdrew. The court-martial concluded on a Thursday afternoon with a verdict that surprised no one who'd followed the evidence: guilty on all charges. Brennan would serve 15 years in military prison, forfeit all rank and benefits, and be dishonorably discharged. As the MPs led him away, Brennan turned one last time to stare at Irene. His expression held no remorse, only bitter hatred for the foreign clerk who'd destroyed his comfortable corruption. Irene met his gaze without flinching. She'd learned in Warsaw that evil people always blamed others for the consequences of their own actions. Outside the hearing room, Admiral King found Irene standing alone in the corridor, watching spring sunlight stream through tall windows. "Miss Hill, a moment of your time." "Of course, sir." King was quiet for a moment, studying her with that same intensity from their first meeting. Finally, he spoke. "I lost a daughter 3 years ago. Elizabeth. She would have been 25 now, probably married with children of her own. She died of pneumonia, a simple infection that turned deadly before we could get her to proper medical care." Irene waited, uncertain where this was leading. "Elizabeth was stubborn like you," King continued. "She saw injustice and couldn't ignore it, even when ignoring it would have been safer. I spent years trying to teach her to be more cautious, to pick her battles, to understand that one person can't change the world." He paused. "I was wrong. One person can change their corner of the world, if they're willing to pay the price. I'm sorry about your daughter, sir." "Don't be. She lived more honestly in her short life than most people manage in 70 years. King pulled an envelope from his jacket. "This is your new assignment. You're being transferred to Naval Intelligence with a rank of ensign. Your work on this case demonstrated analytical skills we desperately need. Irene stared at the envelope, overwhelmed. Sir, I'm not qualified. You're more qualified than half the officers in my command. You have a gift for seeing patterns, for understanding how complex systems work, for persisting when others would quit. Those are exactly the skills we need to win this war. He pressed the envelope into her hands. Besides, someone needs to make sure the next Brennan gets caught before he steals anything else. As King walked away, Irene opened the envelope and read her new orders. She was being assigned to the Atlantic Fleet's Intelligence Division, analyzing enemy communications and supply movements. It was work that would use every skill she developed, every lesson she'd learned from surviving Warsaw and London and the Philadelphia Naval Yard. That evening, Irene stood once more in the parking lot where sailors had beaten her for daring to speak truth. The asphalt was the same, the trucks parked in their usual spots, the Navy Yard humming with its endless rhythm of war preparation. But she was different now. No longer invisible, no longer just a clerk filing papers that others ignored. She'd proven that size didn't matter, that accents didn't matter, that foreign birth didn't matter when someone had courage and truth on their side. And somewhere, watching over everything, Fleet Admiral Ernest King had found a way to honor his daughter's memory by protecting someone else's daughter, even if she came from Poland instead of America, even if she spoke with an accent, even if the only thing connecting them was the stubborn refusal to let injustice go unchallenged. Ensign Irene Hill reported to the Naval Intelligence Office on a Monday morning in May 1943, wearing a uniform that still felt foreign against her skin. The other officers in the Atlantic Fleet's Intelligence Division greeted her with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Most had heard about the Brennan case, but few understood why a former clerk had been granted a commission. Commander Paul Devereaux, who headed the Intelligence Division, made his position clear during their first meeting. I don't care that Admiral King personally recommended you. In this office, you'll prove yourself through results, not connections. We analyze enemy movement patterns, decode intercepted communications, and predict U-boat deployments. One mistake costs lives. Understood? Yes, sir, Irene replied, refusing to be intimidated by his tone. Her first assignment was analyzing merchant convoy losses in the North Atlantic. 17 ships had been sunk in April alone, suggesting U-boats had developed new tactics or acquired better intelligence about Allied shipping routes. Irene spent 3 days studying attack patterns, weather data, and survivor reports, building the same kind of detailed documentation that had exposed Brennan's theft. What she discovered made her blood run cold. The U-boat attacks followed a pattern, but not a tactical one. They consistently targeted convoys that had been scheduled through specific ports, always within 48 hours of departure. The correlation was too precise to be coincidence. Someone was feeding convoy information to German intelligence. Irene drafted a report outlining her findings and presented it to Devereaux on Thursday morning. He read it twice, his expression growing grimmer with each page. You're suggesting we have a German agent operating inside our port coordination offices, Devereaux said finally. Or someone selling information to black market dealers who then sell it to German contacts. The pattern is similar to what Commander Brennan was doing with supplies, small pieces of information that seem insignificant individually, but form a deadly picture when compiled. This is a serious accusation, Ensign Hill. If you're wrong, you'll damage your credibility before your career even begins. Irene thought about the sailors drowning in the Atlantic because someone was trading their lives for money. I'm not wrong, sir. The mathematics are clear. Devereaux studied her for a long moment, then picked up his telephone. Get me Admiral King's office. Tell them it's urgent. Within hours, another investigation was launched, this time targeting port coordination staff and civilian contractors with access to convoy schedules. Irene worked alongside Naval Criminal Investigative Service again, her analytical skills now recognized as valuable rather than troublesome. The investigation took 2 weeks, but the results vindicated her analysis. A civilian radio operator at the New York Port Authority had been transmitting convoy schedules to a German agent in neutral Portugal. The information was then relayed to U-Boat Command, allowing German submarines to position themselves along shipping routes with deadly precision. The operator's arrest led to the dismantling of an entire spy network operating along the eastern seaboard. By June, convoy losses in the North Atlantic had dropped by 40%, a reduction that translated to hundreds of lives saved and thousands of tons of crucial supplies reaching Britain. Admiral King summoned Irene to his office on a warm afternoon in late June. She found him standing at his window, looking out over the Philadelphia Navy Yard with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The convoy losses have decreased significantly since we arrested that radio operator," King said without turning. "Intelligence estimates you've saved approximately 300 lives through your analysis." "I was just doing my job, sir." "No, Ensign. You are doing what very few people can do, seeing patterns where others see chaos, having courage to report what you find, and refusing to be intimidated when powerful people want you silenced." He turned to face her. "Elizabeth would have liked you." It was the first time he'd spoken his daughter's name directly to her. Irene felt the weight of that trust, the vulnerability hidden beneath his admiral's authority. "I wish I could have known her, sir." "So do I." King returned to his desk. "I have another assignment for you. It's classified above your current clearance level, but I'm authorizing an exception." The classified assignment involved a project so secret that Irene was required to sign additional security documents before even learning its nature. Commander Devereaux escorted her to a secure room in the basement of the intelligence building, where 3 other analysts were already working. "Operation Drumbeat," Devereaux explained, spreading maps across a large table. "That's what the Germans call their U-boat campaign against our eastern coast. We've been trying to predict their patrol patterns for months with limited success. Admiral King believes your pattern recognition skills might give us an advantage." The scope of the problem became clear as Irene studied the maps. German U-boats had been operating with devastating efficiency since January 1942, sinking hundreds of merchant ships within sight of American shores. Despite increased patrols and convoy systems, the submarines continued to find victims with disturbing regularity. Irene spent the next week immersed in data, attack locations, moon phases, weather patterns, German radio intercepts, survivor testimonies. She worked 16-hour days, barely sleeping, consuming coffee and sandwiches at her desk while her mind processed thousands of individual data points. The other analysts watched her work with growing fascination. Lieutenant James Hartley, a Yale mathematics graduate, initially dismissed her methods as too intuitive, lacking proper statistical rigor. But as Irene's predictions began accurately forecasting U-boat positions, his skepticism transformed into reluctant respect. "How do you do it?" Hartley asked one evening, studying Irene's latest analysis. "These patterns shouldn't be visible without sophisticated statistical modeling, yet you spotted them using basic arithmetic and map overlays." "I learned to see patterns in Warsaw," Irene replied, marking another location on her map. When Germans occupied the city, survival meant understanding their patrol schedules, supply movements, command hierarchies. You learned to see the rhythms behind chaos, or you died. That's not mathematics. That's something else. It's both. Mathematics is the language, but intuition is the grammar. You need both to truly understand what the numbers are saying. By mid-July, Irene had developed a prediction model that successfully anticipated U-boat positions with 70% accuracy, a dramatic improvement over previous methods. Her system combined traditional naval intelligence with psychological analysis, factoring in German commanders' tendency to repeat successful tactics and avoid previously dangerous areas. Admiral King reviewed her work during a Saturday morning briefing, asking pointed questions about methodology and confidence levels. When she finished presenting, he sat back with an expression that might have been satisfaction. "Ensign Hill, your analysis will be distributed to all Atlantic Fleet commanders effective immediately. Every escort vessel, every patrol aircraft, every coastal defense station will receive daily updates based on your predictions." He paused. "Lives will be saved or lost based on your accuracy. How does that responsibility feel?" Irene thought about her father, shot by Germans for teaching classes. About her mother and younger sister, who'd disappeared during the Warsaw Ghetto liquidation. About the sailors drowning in darkness while U-boats escaped into the Atlantic's vast emptiness. Like purpose, sir. Like finally being able to fight back. The impact of Irene's predictions became evident within weeks. U-boat sinkings decreased sharply as American forces concentrated patrols in areas she'd identified as high-probability zones. Several submarines were destroyed when they surfaced in supposedly safe areas, only to find destroyers waiting based on Irene's analysis. But success brought new challenges. Other intelligence officers, particularly those who'd spent years developing their own prediction methods, resented the recognition she received. Whispers circulated about special treatment from Admiral King, suggestions that her success was exaggerated, complaints that she was too young and inexperienced for such responsibility. The criticism intensified when one of her predictions proved catastrophically wrong. In early August, Irene had identified a specific grid coordinate as low probability for U-boat activity. A convoy was routed through that area and lost 4 ships to a submarine that shouldn't have been there. 47 sailors died because her analysis had been incomplete. Commander Devereaux called her into his office the morning after the attack. His expression was carefully neutral, but Irene could see the disappointment behind his professional mask. "Walk me through what went wrong," he said quietly. Irene had spent the entire night reviewing her calculations, searching for the flaw in her reasoning. "I relied too heavily on historical patterns without accounting for German adaptation. They've been monitoring our convoy routes and realized we were predicting their positions. This attack was deliberate, they went somewhere unexpected specifically because we'd identified it as safe. In other words, they're learning from us just as we're learning from them." "Yes, sir." Devereaux was quiet for a long moment. 47 men are dead, Ensign. Their families will receive telegrams today explaining that their husbands and sons and fathers aren't coming home. How do you live with that?" The question hit harder than any physical blow. Irene had survived beatings, intimidation, and isolation, but this was different. This was responsibility for decisions that directly cost lives. Irene didn't sleep for 3 days after the convoy attack. She returned to her small apartment each night but spent the hours staring at maps and reports, searching for the pattern she'd missed, the variable she hadn't considered. The 47 names haunted her, men she'd never met but whose deaths she felt personally responsible for. On the 4th morning, Admiral King summoned her to his office. She arrived expecting to be relieved of duty, possibly court-martialed for negligence. Instead, she found King sitting with Commander Devereaux and a civilian she didn't recognize, an older man in an expensive suit who studied her with sharp, analytical eyes. "Ensign Hill, this is Dr. Alan Whitmore from the Office of Strategic Services," King said. "He's been reviewing your work on U-boat prediction. Tell her your assessment, Doctor." Whitmore leaned forward, his fingers steepled. "Your methodology is extraordinary, Ensign. I've studied pattern recognition for 20 years, and your intuitive approach surpasses anything I've seen from trained statisticians. But you made a critical error in the August attack. You assumed the enemy was static, following predictable behaviors. They're not. They're intelligent adversaries who adapt and learn." "I understand that now, sir," Irene replied quietly. "Do you?" "Because understanding intellectually is different from incorporating that understanding into your predictive models." Whitmore pulled out papers covered in complex mathematical notation. "I've been developing game theory applications for military intelligence, methods for predicting enemy behavior when they're actively trying to deceive us. Your pattern recognition combined with game theory could create something revolutionary." Over the following weeks, Irene worked with Whitmore to refine her prediction system. Instead of simply analyzing where U-boats had been, they began modeling where German commanders would go if they knew their patterns were being studied. It was chess played on an oceanic scale, with each side trying to anticipate the other's anticipation. The new methodology proved dramatically more effective. By September, Atlantic convoy losses had dropped to their lowest levels since America entered the war. U-boat commanders, frustrated by the Allies' uncanny ability to anticipate their movements, began filing reports suggesting that American intelligence had broken their naval codes. They were partially right. American cryptographers had made progress on German naval ciphers. But the real advantage came from a Polish refugee who'd learned to see patterns while surviving occupation, who'd translated those survival skills into military intelligence, and who'd had the courage to admit when she was wrong and learn from her mistakes. Admiral King watched Irene's evolution with satisfaction that went beyond professional interest. She reminded him so much of Elizabeth, the same stubborn determination, the same refusal to accept limitations, the same ability to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. In October, King invited Irene to a formal dinner at the Officers' Club, ostensibly to celebrate the Intelligence Division's recent successes. But as the evening progressed, Irene realized the gathering was really about introducing her to senior commanders who'd previously dismissed her as King's pet project. Rear Admiral Thomas Crawford, a submarine warfare expert who'd initially opposed her appointment, approached her during dinner. "Ensign Hill, I owe you an apology. I thought Admiral King was making a mistake giving intelligence responsibilities to a former clerk. I was wrong." "Thank you, sir," Irene replied carefully. "Your predictions have changed how we conduct anti-submarine operations. My destroyer captains trust your analysis more than their own instincts now." Crawford paused, then added quietly, "I lost a nephew in April, before your system was implemented. The convoy he was on sailed straight into a U-boat wolf pack. Your work might have saved his life if we'd had it earlier." The conversation left Irene shaken. She'd been so focused on methodology and accuracy that she'd sometimes forgotten the human cost behind every data point, every prediction, every decision. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Admiral King found her standing alone on the club's terrace, looking out over the darkened Navy Yard. "You handled Crawford well," King said, joining her at the railing. "He's not easy to impress. He lost family because we weren't ready. Because I wasn't there to help earlier. You can't think like that. You saved lives from the moment you started working. The people who died before then aren't your responsibility. But the ones who died in August are." King was quiet for a moment. "Yes, they are. And you'll carry those names for the rest of your life, just like I carry the names of every sailor who died under my command. That's the price of leadership, accepting responsibility not just for successes but for failures. How do you live with it? By making sure their deaths meant something. By learning from mistakes and doing better next time." King turned to face her directly. "Elizabeth used to ask me the same question. She saw me struggle with command decisions, watched me receive casualty reports, heard me wake up from nightmares about battles gone wrong. She asked how I could keep going. What did you tell her? That the alternative, giving up, walking away, letting someone less capable make the decisions, would dishonor everyone who'd already sacrificed. We owe it to the dead to keep fighting, to keep improving, to make sure their loss wasn't meaningless." Winter arrived early in Philadelphia that year, bringing snow that transformed the Navy Yard into something almost beautiful. Irene watched it fall from her office window while reviewing the latest U-boat intelligence, thinking about how much had changed since that sunny morning when 3 sailors had beaten her in a parking lot. 9 months had passed since then. 9 months of investigations, trials, threats, and ultimately transformation. She'd gone from an invisible clerk to a commissioned officer whose work directly influenced the Atlantic War. Her prediction system had been adopted by Allied naval forces, with British and Canadian intelligence services requesting access to her methodology. But the most significant change was internal. Irene no longer made herself invisible, no longer apologized for her competence, no longer accepted limitations that others tried to impose. She'd learned that speaking truth to power required courage, but that courage without protection was often martyrdom. Admiral King had given her that protection, treating her like the daughter he'd lost. In December, King summoned her to his office for what he described as a routine update. But when she arrived, she found him holding a telegram with an expression she'd never seen before, something between pride and sorrow. "I've been reassigned to Washington," King said without preamble. Effective January 1944, I'll be overseeing all naval operations from the capital. Fleet Admiral Ingersoll will assume command of Atlantic Fleet operations. Irene felt her stomach drop. King's protection had been absolute, his authority unquestioned. Without him, she'd be vulnerable to the officers who resented her rapid advancement. King seemed to read her thoughts. I've already spoken with Ingersoll. He understands your value and will continue supporting your work. But I'm also arranging something else. He pulled a folder from his desk. These are orders transferring you to Washington as part of my strategic planning staff. You'll work directly for me, analyzing enemy patterns across all theaters of operation. Sir, I don't know what to say. Say yes. Say you'll continue doing the work that saves lives. Say you'll keep proving that courage and competence matter more than background or gender or nationality. King's voice softened slightly. Say you'll honor Elizabeth's memory by being the daughter she would have been proud to know. The words hung in the air between them, acknowledging what had been unspoken for months. King hadn't just been protecting a talented analyst, he'd been honoring his deceased daughter through Irene, giving her the opportunities Elizabeth would never have. I'll make you proud, sir, Irene said quietly. Both of you. The transfer to Washington happened quickly. By January 1944, Irene was working in the Navy Department building, her office 3 doors down from Admiral King's. Her responsibilities expanded beyond U-boat tracking to include Japanese naval movements in the Pacific, supply chain analysis for amphibious operations, and strategic planning for the eventual invasion of Europe. She worked alongside colonels and generals who'd spent decades in military service, her opinions now valued as much as theirs. The Polish refugee with the foreign accent had become Ensign Hill, whose predictions and analysis helped shape Allied naval strategy. But she never forgot where she'd started. Once a month, Irene returned to Philadelphia to visit the Navy Yard, walking through the records office where she'd filed reports and counted equipment. She'd speak with the civilian clerks who now did her old job, reminding them that attention to detail mattered, that their work was essential, that someone was always watching to see who had the courage to speak truth when it was easier to stay silent. On one such visit in March 1944, Irene encountered Mrs. Fletcher, her former supervisor, in the administrative building corridor. The older woman stopped, uncertain how to address someone who'd once been her subordinate but now outranked most of the officers on base. Ensign Hill, Fletcher said formally. It's good to see you. Hello, Mrs. Fletcher. How is the records office? Busier than ever. We've had to hire 6 additional clerks just to keep up with the workload. Fletcher paused, then added, we heard about your work in Washington. The girls in the office follow your career. You've become something of an inspiration. I was just doing my job. Same as they are. No, dear. You were doing much more than that. You showed us that being overlooked doesn't mean being insignificant. That paying attention matters. That one person really can make a difference. Fletcher smiled. We're all very proud of you. As Irene walked back through the parking lot where she'd been beaten 10 months earlier, she thought about the journey from that moment to this one. About the courage required to report Brennan's theft, the terror of facing Admiral King, the isolation of being protected but resented, the responsibility of making decisions that cost or saved lives. She thought about her father, teaching classes in secret after the Germans closed the university, refusing to surrender his dignity even when surrender would have saved his life. About her mother and sister, whose fates she'd never learned but whose memories drove her forward every day. And she thought about Elizabeth King, the daughter an admiral had lost but whose spirit lived on in the protection he'd extended to a foreign clerk who reminded him of what his daughter might have become. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the Navy Yard clean and bright under winter sun. Irene pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the main gate, ready to return to Washington, to continue the work that gave meaning to survival. She was no longer the invisible clerk who counted equipment while others made history. She was Ensign Irene Hill, the analyst whose predictions saved lives, whose courage changed culture, whose story proved that sometimes the smallest voices carried the most important truths. And somewhere, watching over everything, Fleet Admiral Ernest King had found a way to turn loss into legacy, grief into purpose, by treating a Polish refugee like the daughter he'd lost, giving her the protection, opportunities, and trust that Elizabeth would never receive but that Irene would use to help win a war. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 represented the culmination of months of strategic planning, and Irene's intelligence work had played a crucial role. Her analysis of German coastal defenses, supply routes, and troop movements had helped Allied commanders identify the optimal landing sites and timing. She'd spent countless nights in the Navy Department building, correlating weather patterns with enemy patrol schedules, calculating the precise windows when surprise would be achievable. When the invasion succeeded, Admiral King personally acknowledged her contribution during a staff meeting. Ensign Hill's work on German defensive patterns was instrumental in our planning, he told the assembled officers. Her predictions about enemy response times were accurate within 12 minutes, a precision that saved thousands of lives on those beaches. The recognition felt hollow to Irene. She'd seen the casualty reports, knew that despite their best planning, thousands of young men had died in the surf at Omaha Beach, Utah Beach, and the other landing sites. Her analysis had helped, but it hadn't prevented the slaughter that was inevitable in modern warfare. That evening, she found King standing alone in his office, looking at a map of Europe with pins marking Allied advances. He seemed older than usual, the weight of command evident in the set of his shoulders. "Sir, are you all right?" Irene asked from the doorway. King turned, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely tired. "I was thinking about Elizabeth. She would have been 28 today. Probably would have been working in a hospital somewhere, saving lives the way you save them with your analysis." Irene stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. "Tell me about her." King was silent for a moment, then began speaking in a voice that carried memories like cargo. "She wanted to be a doctor, but medical schools weren't accepting women in significant numbers back then. So she became a nurse, working at a civilian hospital in Boston. She caught pneumonia from a patient and was gone within a week. I was at sea when it happened, couldn't even attend her funeral. I'm so sorry, sir. She wrote me letters constantly when I was deployed. Told me about her patients, about the cases that challenged her, about the administrators who didn't think women should be making medical decisions." King picked up a photograph from his desk, a young woman with her father's determined eyes. "The last letter I received from her talked about a hospital board meeting where she'd argued for better quarantine procedures. They dismissed her as too young, too female, too concerned with details that weren't her responsibility." Irene understood immediately. "Like they dismissed me for caring too much about supply reports." "Exactly. When you walked into my office that day, bloody and scared but still determined to do the right thing, you reminded me so much of her that it physically hurt." King replaced the photograph carefully. "I've protected you not just because you're talented, but because protecting you felt like getting a second chance to protect Elizabeth." The admission hung between them, honest and raw. Irene had suspected as much, but hearing King voice it made the relationship suddenly clear. She wasn't just his protege or his analyst. She was, in some indefinable way, a surrogate for the daughter he'd lost. "I hope I've honored that trust, sir. You've exceeded it. Elizabeth would have been proud to know you. More importantly, she would have been proud to know that her father learned from his mistakes with her, that he finally understood that protecting someone's potential is more important than protecting them from risk." King returned to his desk, his momentary vulnerability masked behind professional authority again. "I have new orders for you. The Pacific Theater needs intelligence coordination for the final push toward Japan. You'll be analyzing their defensive strategies, predicting their responses to our island-hopping campaign. It's the most critical intelligence work of the war." "When do I leave?" 2 weeks. It means missing VE Day celebrations when they come, but the work in the Pacific can't wait." King met her eyes with something that looked like paternal pride. "You've come a long way from that parking lot, Ensign Hill. We both know I couldn't have done it without you, sir." "No, you couldn't have. But I also couldn't have won this war without you." King extended his hand across the desk. "Thank you for letting me be the father I should have been to Elizabeth." Irene shook his hand, feeling tears threaten for the first time since Warsaw. "Thank you for being the father I lost, sir." The war in the Pacific ended on a humid August afternoon in 1945, with Japan's surrender following the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Irene received the news in a Navy intelligence office in Pearl Harbor, where she'd spent the past year analyzing Japanese defensive positions and predicting their strategic responses to American advances. Her work had contributed to successful operations at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, helping commanders understand where Japanese forces would concentrate their defenses and which approaches would minimize American casualties. Thousands of lives saved through pattern recognition and careful analysis, numbers that should have felt triumphant but instead felt like inadequate compensation for the millions who'd died before reaching victory. Admiral King sent her a personal telegram 2 days after the surrender: "Your work helped bring our boys home. Elizabeth would be proud." "So am I, King." Irene kept that telegram for the rest of her life. The transition from war to peace proved disorienting for someone who'd spent nearly 3 years living in a state of constant urgency. Irene returned to Washington in September 1945, uncertain what her role would be in a peacetime Navy that was already beginning to demobilize. She found her answer during a final meeting with Admiral King in his Navy Department office. He'd aged visibly during the war years, his face lined with the burden of commanding millions of sailors through history's greatest conflict. But his eyes still carried that sharp intelligence she'd first encountered in Philadelphia. "Ensign Hill, or should I say Lieutenant Hill, since your promotion was approved this morning, the Navy is establishing a permanent intelligence analysis division. They want you to head the pattern recognition section, training the next generation of analysts in your methodology." "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm suited for peacetime military service. I became a soldier because there was a war to fight. And now there's a peace to maintain. The world didn't become safer just because the shooting stopped. We still need people who can see patterns, who can anticipate threats, who have courage to report what they find even when it's politically inconvenient." King leaned back in his chair. "But I understand if you want something different. You've earned the right to choose your own path." Irene thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From Warsaw's occupation to London's bombs to Philadelphia's parking lot to Washington's corridors of power. From invisible clerk to intelligence officer. From victim to victor. "I'll stay," she said finally. "But not just for the Navy. I'm staying because there are other women like me, refugees, immigrants, people with accents and different backgrounds, who deserve to know that courage and competence can overcome prejudice. Someone needs to show them that path." King smiled, and Irene saw approval that went beyond professional respect. Elizabeth would have said something very similar. She believed that those who've been given opportunities have an obligation to create opportunities for others. Over the following years, Irene built the Pattern Recognition Division into one of the Navy's most valuable intelligence assets. She trained hundreds of analysts, many of them women who'd entered military service during the war and refused to surrender their positions when peace came. Her methodology became standard curriculum at naval intelligence schools, her wartime success stories used as case studies in leadership courses. But her most important legacy wasn't technical or tactical, it was cultural. Irene Hill, the Polish refugee who'd been beaten in a parking lot for daring to report corruption, had proven that the Navy's strength came not from tradition or exclusivity but from recognizing talent wherever it appeared. Admiral King retired in 1945, but he remained in contact with Irene until his death in 1956. In his final letter to her, written when he knew his time was short, he thanked her for helping him understand what Elizabeth had tried to teach him, that protecting people meant giving them freedom to rise, not shielding them from risk. When Irene finally retired from the Navy in 1968 as a commander with 25 years of distinguished service, the ceremony was attended by 3 admirals, dozens of former students, and intelligence officers from allied nations who'd learned her techniques. During her speech, she spoke about courage, about the importance of seeing clearly even when others preferred comfortable illusions, about the obligation to speak truth regardless of consequences. and she spoke about a fleet admiral who'd lost a daughter but found a way to honor her memory by protecting someone else's daughter, a foreign clerk who'd been beaten bloody but had refused to stay silent, who'd proven that size and accent and background meant nothing when courage and competence stood together. The parking lot in Philadelphia where Irene Hill had been beaten in 1943 was paved over decades ago, replaced by modern buildings that bear no memory of violence or vindication. But in Navy intelligence offices around the world, her story is still told to new analysts learning their craft, a reminder that sometimes the most important patterns aren't in the data, they're in the courage to report what the data reveals, and the wisdom to protect those who have that courage. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.